What's happening, everybody? Welcome to the channel. Thank you for tuning in. If you've never been here before, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Everybody else that's been here, welcome back. Welcome back, like welcome back, Carter. For those of you that have never been here, I survived 17 years in the New York prison system, and today we are going to talk about the 5 worst days that I ever had during that experience. The 5 moments that I'll never forget. There's many moments that I'll never forget because there was so much trauma. I witnessed so much insanity during my time incarcerated. Um, I watched a man run into a roll of razor wire on purpose. A mentally ill man just sprint into a roll of razor wire. I've watched people get their faces melted with boiling baby oil and boiling cooking oil. Um, I watch people get both sides of their face slashed open with scalpels on both sides, where the guy came up behind him with 2 scalpels and ripped both sides of his face open, and his face just opened up. I've watched close to a dozen men get killed during my 17 years incarcerated. I've watched men get beaten by groups of gangs. I've watched a gang attack one person, 10, 15 people attacking someone in the middle of the prison yard. This list of things can go on forever. I mean, there's tons of things that are horrific things that I witnessed during the 17 years in prison. And I tell you that because if you're living the wrong way and if you're doing something that could eventually get you incarcerated, these are the things that you will be exposed to. These are the things that you can become a victim of. These are things that can happen to you while you're incarcerated. I've watched numerous men get their life ended because of disrespect, because another prisoner thought that they were disrespected by that prisoner and they took their life because of it. So when you're out in the street and you think it's all fun and games, you're drug dealing, your drug possession, or you're going to assault someone, or you're going to assault someone in a road rage incident, all these things that you think there could be no repercussions for. All of a sudden, there are repercussions, there are consequences, and you end up in prison in the blink of an eye. I told you in many videos it only takes one 5-second decision to change your life forever. This is the discipline that you have to live with. This is the self control that you must live your life with in order to refrain from ever becoming part of the system. But we're not talking, we're actually not talking about that. I'm just telling you that you would be subjected to those things. We're talking about the 5 worst days that I had in prison. And so, besides witnessing those daily events, I would say the worst day that I ever had in prison would be when my grandfather died. My grandfather was the police commissioner. That was my mother's father. He was retired, and he was like a father to me. He was everything to me. My grandparents were everything to me. And my grandfather died while I was in prison in 2005. And not being able to be there by his side, not being able to hold him, not being able to tell him I love him, not being able to say goodbye to the man that meant everything in the world to me was one of the hardest days that I ever had in prison. Um, it's something that is very hard to forgive myself for. Um, as my grandfather being the former police commissioner who spent 30 years in law enforcement, he never judged me. He always took care of me. He always supported me. He always loved me. And he was a very special and unique man, and that was one of the hardest days when I had my mother told me that he passed away, and I was locked in that prison cell, hysterical, crying, distraught. As I said, guilty, tremendously guilty for being in there and not being able to be next to him. That's something that I have to live with forever. That he died knowing that his grandson was in prison. And I just didn't want him to see me as a loser. I didn't want him to see me as a waste of life or a prisoner. He didn't see me that way, but I saw myself that way, and I wanted to make it home before that happened. So that was one of the hardest days I ever had. And it was shortly after that. It was 2 months later that my wife. I was married to a woman who was like a childhood sweetheart of mine, and she got leukemia at the age of 28 years old, and she died while I was married to her. Um, she was visiting me every weekend. She was my wife, and we would go on conjugal visits together every 45 days. And she came on one of those conjugal visits, and she told me that she found out that she had leukemia. Um, and she didn't last long. She died within a year, less than a year. It was very aggressive blood cancer. And yeah, losing my wife right after I lost my grandfather was definitely one of the toughest moments that I ever had. Um, I felt so bad for her. I felt so guilty again. This was a woman that didn't do any drugs. She didn't smoke. She didn't drink. She was a physical therapist. She worked, and she died at a very young age from leukemia. Um, that was one of the hardest days of my life. And I always said that you've heard the saying that it comes in threes. And it was less than a month later that my lifelong best friend, one of my closest friends in the world from childhood, uh, died and it was killed in Iraq. His name was Jacob. And that just, I had a nervous breakdown. That was one of the hardest days of my life in prison too. So I had lost my grandfather, lost my wife, and lost my best friend, all within about 6 months. And I was in my cell, and I had like a nervous breakdown. I started freaking out. I started smashing everything in the cell. I had a typewriter. I threw the typewriter off the wall. I was screaming and crying and freaking out. I was laying on the floor of the cell. And what impacted me the most about that moment, a moment that I'll never forget, is a correctional officer came down to the cell because he heard all the breaking, and I broke my desk and screaming and yelling. And he came down to the cell and he looked at me in the cell. Everybody knew what was happening to me. Everyone heard that my I was losing people back to back to back. And so the officer knew that my wife died. He knew that my grandfather died. And then he found out about my friend, my closest friend, Jacob, in Iraq. And he came down to the cell and he saw me in that condition. And he looked at me. He was a real decent correctional officer. And he called my name. He said, Fish. And I looked up at him with tears coming down my face, feeling like the world was over and everything was about to end. And I looked at this officer and he started crying. And he had tears coming down his face. And he just looked at me and he said, Fish, I wish I could help you. He says, I'm so sorry. He said, you have to stay strong. And I looked at this officer crying, and just to see that he cared, to see that this officer was being so impacted, it was at that moment that I knew he saw me as a human being. He didn't see me as a prisoner. He didn't see me as an animal. He didn't see me as a waste of life. He recognized the pain that I was in as a fellow human being. And he just started crying because I think he imagined himself in my situation. And that was also one of the hardest times. One of the hardest times that I ever had in prison. You know, those were three of the worst times. Another time that was really, really hard for me is I was going to lunch. They had called lunch in the prison, and all the cells open up, and then all the men walk to lunch. And when I came out of my cell and walked about two or three cells, something caught my eye, and I looked in the cell, and there was a guy that I knew hung himself. He killed himself. And he was hanging from a rope inside of his cell from a ripped bed sheet. He took a ripped bed sheet and he tied it to the top of the bars and he killed himself. And Spanish guy, I was really close with him. And when I saw him hanging there, I had never seen anyone take their own life, personally. Most people haven't witnessed that. And I saw him, no one had discovered him yet. He must have just did it. And I started screaming. I couldn't get into the cell because the cell was locked. And I started screaming to the officer, 27 cell hung himself, 27 cell hung himself. And he immediately opened the cell. And I ran into the cell and lifted up his body to take the pressure off him. And I was holding him up. And I was crying so hard. I will never forget. I'll never forget that moment of holding that guy up. And, you know, it made me realize I knew where I was already. But that incident, that scene right there reminded me where I was and reminded me of the intense level of pain that myself and the men were experiencing in there. I'm not talking about whether we did it to ourselves or not. That's a different topic, you know. But living through that and seeing that and feeling that and holding that man in my arms until the officer came running down there and cut the bed sheet uh, was very traumatic. It was very traumatic. And I went back in my cell that night and I wondered how I was going to make it. I wondered if he had the answer, if he felt better now that he was gone, because his pain was gone. And that's a moment that I will never forget inside of the prison system. And one of the last ones, there's more, I'm just giving you 5 of them. One of the last ones was another time I came out of my cell. Oh, no, I didn't come out of my cell. It was in the morning. It was breakfast time. It was early in the morning. And the guy 2 cells away from me died of natural causes while he was sitting on the toilet. He must have had a heart attack. I guess in the middle of the night when he was in his cell, he must have felt pain or felt like he had to go to the bathroom and he sat on the toilet and he died. And that's how he was found, with his pants down, sitting on the toilet inside of a prison cell in Attica prison. And I looked at that reality and I said, I don't want to die in here. What a lonely way to die. What a disgraceful way to die. What a pitiful way to die. Alone in your cell on the toilet with correctional officers that will just come pick up your body, throw it on a stretcher, take you down to the morgue, and then call your family to come pick you up. And if you don't have family to pick you up, bury you in Potter's Field. And that guy dying on the toilet just scared me so much. It scared me so much that I just always said to myself, I don't want to die in here. If I die, I just want to die in the free world. I don't want to die in prison, trapped in my cell, alone. And if I can end with a message to the youth that are watching and the kids that are watching and the young adults that are watching, don't ever let the stories I just told you become your reality. Don't ever allow yourself to lose control or have such terrible judgment or such terrible decision making that you end up in that position when you're in there to experience those things and see those things, witness those things. Because I've been home for 12 years, I'm in my 50s, and those things are stuck with me until the day I die. They caused PTSD inside of me. They caused a trauma inside of me. to witness those things and experience the loss that I experienced in there is unforgettable. Unforgettable. I'm sorry for such a sad video, but it's important that people understand the reality of what happens when you're incarcerated and what you experience when you're incarcerated. And when you're locked in your cell, you can't even pick up the phone back then to call someone and say, listen, I just need someone to talk to. You had to wait, you know, and it's a sad reality. So that's it for today. I'll post another video soon. Appreciate you guys watching. Hope you hit the subscribe button. Check out many of the videos. And I promise the next video will be a little more upbeat. All right, guys? You take care. All my